This week on Talking Real, we continue our discussion with Fred Underwood about why diversity is important for the Realtor Association, with a particular focus this week on professional standards and ethics and advocacy.
How do we work through individual ethics, and how do we tackle this issue of diversity with Fred Underwood?
Welcome back to Talking Real, brought to you by the Oklahoma Association of Realtors. This is episode 146 of Talking Real. Back in the studio with your host, Jeff and Nabil. Nabil, how's your day?
My day's going well. I walked in this morning to a funny thing on my desk.
Funny, I got in your office before you did, and this made me laugh. I saw it. And
it's my very first almanac.
Yes, you got the Old Farmer's Almanac.
It's so funny. Kristen and I were talking about this, and she's like, "You don't know what? Have you never seen one?" I was like, "No, I don't know." And so it's funny. She left this with a little note saying, "I got you your first almanac." That's
so funny. Yeah, if you're from Oklahoma, you are familiar with the Farmer's Almanac, and so I'm excited that you're not going to get to experience that. That's excellent. That's excellent. So this week on Talking Real, we are continuing our conversation and discussion about diversity with Fred Underwood from the National Association of Realtors. Last week, you may recall, and if you haven't listened to last week, you really need to go listen to that one first. So go check out episode 145, then come back to this one. But last week, we just started setting the stage of just why are we even talking about diversity in the Realtor Association? Why does it matter? And we started out by talking about professional development, education, and kind of how diversity plays into that. This week on Talking Real, we're talking about how diversity plays into professional standards and ethics, and also how diversity plays into advocacy and why that's an important concept for both of those things. And I'm really excited because this gets, I don't know, I feel like these two sessions really hit hard for me, these two discussions that we have. And so I'm excited to get to this one.
Me too. So let's do it.
Let's just jump right in.
And when you kind of think about it, you're in the middle of a transaction and there's a realtor on the other side of the transaction. Your life is made much easier when that realtor on the other side of the transaction knows what they're doing, and you don't have to help them learn what they need to know, and they're not trying to teach you stuff that you should know. So your professional development's taken care of, everyone's trained, but now you come into a situation where, because of cultural values and history and other things, there might be an ethical dispute. And you want the person on the other side of the transaction to operate ethically, just like they want you to operate ethically. But if you don't have a shared understanding of what those ethics are, you can lead to a lot of challenges. And ethical issues come up a lot in our association. It's not something that's unusual, and it's often comes from misunderstandings. And so we have a process in our grievance process and our ethics process that our preferred course of action is to correct something and help people understand the right way to move forward. So what happens when there's big cultural differences in understanding ethics? And some of you may have read recently, there's been a lot of discussion in certain news articles that, well, there's a difference between cultures who operate on guilt and cultures that operate on shame and cultures that operate on fear. Those are kind of negative values. So I want to turn around and look at it from a positive perspective. There's differences in cultures based on the hierarchy of ethical values. And I want to pose this. When you're faced with a situation where someone you are very close to, either in your personal life or your business, is accused of doing something wrong, you have two competing ethics that are involved. One is, I stand by my family, I stand by my team, I stand by my company, I stand by my profession. We are loyal people. But we also have this ethics that we're honest people. So when honesty and loyalty conflict, this creates opportunities for very strong misunderstandings on ethical questions. And if you think back maybe 10 or so years when O.J. Simpson was accused of murder, and you think about, did you sort of believe O.J., or did you believe all the other witnesses? And why did you do that? And we think about everything that we look at. Do you believe something based on the truthfulness of it, or do you believe something based on who and what you're loyal to? And culturally, particularly our legal system, and therefore our ethics system, and just the functioning of our economy is based, hopefully still based on honesty. And you think about when you go in and you're a witness in court, and some of you are expert witnesses, and others are witnesses to actual behavior at a ethics hearing or a grievance procedure. And even our code of ethics says you should be honest in your dealings and in your in your testimony. And you sit up and the clerk of the court says, "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth?" And you say, "Yes." You never asked, "Do you swear to be loyal to your brother and your cousin and your business partner and no one else?" No, we're not asked that. Now, so what happens in a culture, though, where loyalty is held to a higher regard than honesty when they're in conflict? Now you have a misunderstanding. And the reality of it is, now you get to the ethical hearing, and you have the people who hold honesty as the highest ethic, believing that the other people who might hold loyalty as the highest ethic believe they're being unethical. So our association to a newcomer who maybe comes from that culture that holds loyalty as a higher value says they're being unethical. But the person from that particular community believes that they are being ethical at the highest level, and therefore thinks you're discriminating against them, that you're being unfair. And so you walk away from that hearing process. Maybe there's a resolution and the hearing board says, "Yes, you violated the code of ethics, here's your education session," etc. But the real feeling is, "Yeah, they were unethical. I'm glad I took them to the board. I'm going to be watching out for them next time." To the other person coming back and saying, "God, they treated me so unfairly. They don't understand that this was what I had to do. And, I'm going to be watching carefully." What does that do to the next time you have a transaction together? It doesn't help us in our industry. But if you have that diversity in your grievance committees and in your professional standards hearing boards and in the people who do the training, you can start to explain that regardless of your own personal ethics within the Realtor Association, you can really emphasize honesty, and you can have conversations of how realtors can address that honesty. You can really have conversations about how you would address honesty and how you would address the conflict. And you can even start to talk about loyalty to the organization requires honesty. So by understanding ethics, you can build, understanding diversity, you can build stronger ties to ethics. And boards that have engaged and involved diversity in their associations into all of their committees see that type of conflict in their professional standards area decline. And the benefit of that is that we get back to that stage where the realtors are, even coming from two different transactions, are working together to execute a transaction, to close the transaction. Our shared goal is to make the deal. Even though one of us is working for client A and the other's working for client B, we come together and the transaction can happen. So having inclusion in your ethics work can be very effective at building a stronger association and building that ethics across the board.
I don't know about your thoughts, Nabil, but I find this section talking about ethics and the different sort of cultural differences in how ethics are perceived, sort of the highest level of ethics, to be one of the most challenging and something that I've never even thought about. You know, he talks about this conflict between loyalty and sort of honesty, which to me, it seems like, well, obviously honesty is clearly the highest calling, right? But that's
an easier distinction to draw, right? Honesty.
Right. Where, well, you got to tell the truth, right? Nobody wants to talk about, you know, it's okay to, you know, lie if it's in support of somebody. But at the same time, like, I understand that bias towards being loyal to somebody. You know, we see this, like, if you ever watch Dateline or any of these like crime shows, right? There's like overwhelming evidence that somebody committed a murder or whatever, but their family may still be like, I know they're innocent. I know they're innocent. I know
there's no way he could do it. He's not that person.
Right. Even if they've admitted it and everything else, they still stand by the loyalty. And so, like, I see this concept of when it comes to family and friends and people close to you, that sometimes the higher ethical calling, in a way, is that loyalty. And that there are cultural differences in that as well, that other cultures may have a different philosophy on that. And so I absolutely see that. And I find this to be one of the most challenging things because, like you said, it leads to conflict in ethical hearings and things like that, where you've got two parties who think that they are doing ethically the right thing and think the other party is doing ethically the wrong thing. And it's more about perceptions, cultural perceptions, beliefs, and those kinds of things that they don't understand about each other.
Right.
And so leading that towards, why is diversity important? Because people need to understand these cultural views and beliefs better by having a diverse group of people that they're around. And I don't know. I just find that whole thing to be very, very challenging. And super interesting. It's something I've never really thought about.
Yeah. I was going to say it's definitely challenging, but I also feel like it is very fascinating and interesting, because when you dive into the different cultures and the differences, like Fred mentioned, on some cultures rate loyalty to family higher than honesty, or, you know, vice versa, whatever that is. It's so interesting to, when you have that diversity and you're learning from each other, then you get to know that person's perspective and their point of view. And then you can approach it and be like, I know you usually think this way, but XYZ reasons, this is what it is. And then maybe they'll understand it a little better and it'll be less of a conflict in that sense.
Right.
So it is, and the biases, and it's not black and white.
No,
you know, especially this area of it is not black and white.
Right. And when it comes to ethics, I think so many of us, whether we're talking about the code of ethics or we're just talking about sort of our personal ethical standards that we have that are not necessarily the codified NAR code of ethics, but either way, I think we tend to view it as black and white. Well, it's like, well, it says that, like, you got to do it this way,
right,
without being open to some nuance in how that's perceived and interpreted and things like that. And so that's a challenge, I think, to understand that people can read the same words or have a similar belief but slightly different, or a slightly different understanding. And so how do we understand that? Because I think this is really eye-opening to me, to think that, like, well, it says you have to be honest. It says you have to treat people fairly. It says you have to do all these various things. But how are people actually perceiving that? How are they interpreting it? And do those words conflict with their personal ethics, which I think is also a challenge.
Right. And what is fair to you might not be fair to me. Right.
Right. and so I think, like he points out, that the answer is not, well, one is right, one is wrong, or anything like that. Or maybe they are, right? Maybe he talked about, you know, the criminal justice system. Truth should be, and honesty should be, the highest standard in those, right? Like, we want to get to the truth at the end of the day in something like the criminal justice system. And so maybe there is a right answer in that respect, but how do we get past that? And it's not just, well, we have to tell everybody this is the way it is, but it's having an understanding of their views. So by having, you know, more inclusion of diversity within the association and in life in general, we are exposed to other viewpoints. We have discussions. We understand other people better. And that leads us to less misunderstanding, less conflict, and more, well, I understand their perspective, so here's how we can address that. Like he mentioned, by explaining that, well, loyalty to the association means that you have to put honesty first. There's like ways to get to it,
right?
Perhaps, but all that requires is that we have to know what people think and believe, and the only way we can do that is by interacting with them, and that means including them.
Right. Totally. I mean, I think defining ethics is like our lifelong pursuit, right?
Right. So it's, again, a fascinating topic that this one really kind of hit hard for me, of like, man, this is just a really interesting concept. So.
Yeah. And I love thinking about this stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm going to be thinking about this for a long time.
Absolutely. But we're not done yet. Next, we got to talk about advocacy and how the inclusion of diversity in the association is beneficial for advocacy. So let's get back to Fred and hear what he has to say about advocacy.
Let's do it.
And the third area I want to address is perhaps the most obvious for many of us, and that is in advocacy. And advocacy is not just our relationship with the government. It's our relationship with the public at large. It's our relationship with companies who might want to locate in our community. And I don't know how many of you have actually participated in this, but a lot of boards will be very active in working with their communities to attract a new employer into the community or to keep an employer in the community. So all of this is advocacy. And inclusion of diversity can be very effective at strengthening our advocacy efforts. At the national level, this became apparent about 20 years ago when the inevitable shift in Congress, it was going to shift from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. And the minority leaders of the Judiciary Committee, the banking subcommittees that look at housing, the Small Business Committee, on down the line, the Ways and Means Committee, were all members of the Black Caucus. And we looked at who our federal coordinators were for those members of Congress. And in some cases, they didn't even live in the district. And only one of those coordinators was African American. So it made it more difficult for us to differentiate ourselves in our lobbying with the banks, with the major corporations, with all of those lobbying groups, because we're a grassroots organization. We have lobbyists, and they're very good lobbyists. We have good lobbyists. We invest a lot of resources in our lobbyists, but our strength comes from our grassroots. It comes from each of you answering that call to action. It comes from each of you investing in RPAC, and it comes from having volunteer leaders that are our federal political coordinators and other key contacts that have a personal relationship with a member of Congress, can help them understand the issue from a community, neighbor to neighbor, person to person perspective. But we didn't have it in those districts. And so over time, we started looking, and we realized that in some of those districts, we didn't even have an idea of who our members were that were from those districts that would be active. So that's why they had FPCs outside of the community. And that boils back down to the state association, the local association. So let's look at it in terms of your county. Let's say your county has a population of 25,000. And you break down, and your county might have 20%, 25% of all these different ethnic groups. It is very likely that there are going to be elected officials in your county and appointed officials in your county that come from one of these communities. And when you go in to lobby, they're going to look at who comes in and say, are these my neighbors? Are these people from the community, or is this a business? Is this the bank? Is this the large agricultural conglomerate coming in? Or are these my neighbors coming in? Are these the people that I represent? These are the people who vote for me. When they see that it's their neighbors, and particularly if they represent a constituency that you also have in that group, the tie is going to be much deeper, and they're going to say, oh, wow, we are really working together on this. And back when Mel Watt was chairman of the Black Caucus, his federal coordinator is an African American, and he came to me and he said, I want some help to reach out and pull together our other African American brokers to work with our congressman. Long story short, he calls a meeting. The congressman is going to come. He asked me to come just to see what he's been able to accomplish. I go to his community. The meeting is held in a local community venue, and there's about 100 people in the venue. And the congressman walks in and turns to the organizer and said, oh, wow, you got all the black brokers from across the country here? And he said, no, these are all the people from this community. And that changed the perspective of the congressman towards real estate. Because now he looked around then he looked around the room and he said, oh, I know you. And suddenly it's no longer this outside organization lobbying him. It's actually his neighbors and friends. And think of the power that has with your city council, if you have one, or your county board, and especially your state legislature.
I think the advocacy component of this is something that also didn't necessarily like strike me right at the beginning, is the importance and the way he connects it between, we have lobbyists, right? And we hire people to go out and lobby the legislature. But at our heart, we're a grassroots organization. That's why we have Capital Conference every year, where we try to get as many realtors as possible to come in and have them go talk to their actual legislator from their district. Right. Same thing, we have a mid-year conference on the national level where realtors from all over the country come in and you go talk to the legislators, the congressmen and women from your district. Mm-hmm. And so, the importance of having volunteer leaders who can go to those elected officials, whether it's city council, your state legislature, or otherwise, to speak to them from that community, neighbor to neighbor, because the elected officials look at the people coming in and they say, who is this is coming to talk to me? Is this just somebody who has an economic interest in what's going on? Or are these my neighbors? Are these my voters? Are these the people who support me? Are they my constituents? Because those are the people who they're going to give the most time to. They're going to have that connection to and be most likely to help out. Right. And so if we're not doing a good job of including every community, then how can we then go talk to elected officials to work on issues? I mean, this was like the thought that I had was, how can we address community issues if we haven't included the community in our membership?
Right. Because how do you know?
How do you even know what the issues are, right? Yeah. We're just maybe projecting what the issues are in that locality, in that community, in that state, wherever it is. Mm-hmm. But we don't know. We may understand that a particular issue affects one piece of the community in a certain way, but it may affect a different piece of the community in a different way. But they're not at the table to tell us how that would impact negatively or positively, or whatever the case is, their community. And that's crucially important, because how can we go to the legislature or the city council and say, this is a really important issue and here's why it's a problem, when we may have other people in that community or a different, connection to that community saying, no, that's actually, it's different than what you think for us, and here's why.
And then perhaps the solution to solve it isn't what you think it might be, but they have a better solution or an easier solution, or be like, it's a simple fix. This is what we have to do, because they know the issue. Right. And it's really interesting, because when you think about diversity, the first thing that comes into your head is like race, age, gender, right? That's the first thing that comes diversity wise. But being a grassroots organization, diversity is so much more than that. It's the community, it's where you live, it's, everything is diversity. Right. just throw it all in there. Right. It all counts for it. So, and like Fred said, when you talk to an elected official and you're from that community, it makes such a bigger impact. It's like, and the thing that went through my mind at that point was, it's the difference, because all realtors are in sales, right? It's the difference between making a cold call and getting a warm referral. Right. Being, it's that difference in trying to make that connection.
Absolutely. I think that's a fantastic point. And you mentioned in Oklahoma, it could be any number of things. It could be urban versus rural, right? And so are we making sure everybody's got that seat at the table from different parts of the state? And again, within one legislative district in Oklahoma, you may have $1 million homes and $50,000 homes within the same district. But, how are we including people to go talk to that legislator from that whole community and not just a piece of it? Because we have to understand that like it requires everybody's voice to understand, again, what the issues are, how to address them, what's good, what's bad, and then to go speak to those elected officials about them from that place. And so, again, that starts with, not just, having that complete representation of the community.
Yeah. Yeah. And that story that Fred just said about the official saying, "Oh, is this everyone from the nation?" No, this is your community.
Absolutely.
That's eye-opening.
Absolutely. So getting back into further, not just from advocacy, advocacy is important, but also just sort of how actions have consequences. We're going to jump in and talk a little bit about that right now.
And then let's talk about when you're going to that corporation and you want to talk to the corporation. Hewlett-Packard was going to build some new plants. And they were looking at Spokane, Washington to build a plant. And in fact, they'd already made a commitment to move to Spokane. I think they'd already signed some leases and they were getting ready. And they sent the plant manager up there to look for housing so that she then could bring her team and recruit her team. Now, Hewlett-Packard their employee workforce is very diverse. This particular plant manager happened to be a white woman, and she goes up, she contacts a realtor, probably through a relocation company, started to be shown around town, and the realtor starts making inappropriate, steering racial comments about different parts of the community. You don't want to live here, you'd rather live here, all the kinds of things we teach members not to do. The company, that plant manager, sent a letter to the executive of the board saying, "Do you realize what this realtor just did? We are not going to move to Spokane. These 1,000 jobs are not going to be here because we cannot bring our diverse workforce into a community where the real estate profession is discriminating." But put another way, if you had that diversity in your association and you went out to meet with the leaders of Hewlett-Packard and said, "We want you to move here." And it's not showcase, but maybe your person that does commercial real estate, your commercial committee chair speaks about, is Hispanic and speaks about the community, not the Hispanic community, about the community. And maybe your board president, who might be white, but looks, has brought together a team, speaks about how the team works together to talk about real estate issues. And then another member of the team that specializes in residential real estate might be African American or Native American and just talks about what it's like to look for housing in the community. That message, that message that's given to that company is one, this board is inclusive and it reflects the values that we need to make our company successful. So that kind of advocacy, by having diversity involved, will help you achieve lots of your goals as an association. It's not a magic pill. And we can talk about in a different time some of the tools that you use to bring that diversity, but it's really important to understand that when we focus on diversity and inclusion, we have to link it to why we exist as an association, and we have to focus our activities there. One of the biggest mistakes that we make as associations, and it's not limited to the realtor world, it's consistently repeated. Just because the person you're engaging happens to be Black or happens to be Hispanic or Native American or gay or some other minority that you're trying to include, don't put them just in the diversity committee. Don't put them in a special committee that's not tied to any of these areas. Make sure that people go where their passions are, and identify people who are going to help you achieve these three core goals. Doesn't mean don't do the other things. Doesn't mean You can have a person, there could be a Black realtor who comes to you and wants to get involved, and they're passionate about inclusion and diversity, and they want to be on the diversity committee. I wouldn't say no to that person, and I would appoint that person, but there's probably somebody else that you would look at, and they would be passionate about, every conversation you have with them is about how the taxes that the tax assessments the city are doing in their area just don't make sense, or they can't get a decent appraisal, or they, any of those kinds of questions. We'll put them on the committees that deal with those issues, because their advocacy, their education, their professional standards, put them in those areas, and that will help you achieve much greater inclusion of diversity, but more importantly, in the long run, it will make you a much more effective association.
The story about Hewlett-Packard does illustrate that point of, words matter and actions matter. Mm-hmm. And of course, that one was a pretty profound story, but, even on just such a smaller scale, it can have such an impact on individual people's lives, by doing the things that we're not supposed to do.
Right.
Steering, racially motivated decisions, those kinds of things that are obviously a problem. And the reality is there's still a problem today. He talked about how this one realtor did that. Well, the NAR professional standards, some changes are being considered that discuss things like looking at what are realtors saying in their personal lives, not just in a real estate transaction, but can we hold them accountable under the code of ethics for personal remarks made, and so making some changes there. And that's the reality, because they're getting many complaints at the national level about realtors in places saying things that are racially discriminatory or discriminatory in other ways. And that impacts the whole industry. It impacts individual people that are looking for houses, how they feel, whether they're comfortable about buying a house in that community. I mean, all those kinds of things that come into it. And, again, how do you stop it? And it's by tearing down those barriers, by having a diverse, fully included community within your association, and people interact with people of other backgrounds, and some of those preconceived notions and beliefs start to change,
right, and kind of fade away.
Yeah.
But also, like, something that he mentioned, it's not a magic pill.
Right.
So just because we become more diverse as an association, or include a lot of different people, that's not gonna fix or solve everything. In fact, that's probably the first step, because then at that point, then you gotta learn and get those perspectives, and then I feel like the real work begins.
Right. And again, it's changing the way leadership is considered, getting people into and like you said, it's not just when you talked about going and talking to a corporation or something along those lines, and it's not putting on a specifically racial or ethnic or whatever diverse show,
right?
But it's just, you have people from different backgrounds that are talking about the real estate industry and giving their perspective. So it's not about, well, we just want to, again, look diverse for the sake of looking diverse. It's not that at all. It's not, oh, well, let's get people of different backgrounds and we'll just put them on the diversity committee. Well, they probably know other things too, and have other places,
right,
that they can contribute. So, like you said, like you just mentioned, it's not a magic pill, but it's still a step in the right direction to make sure that our association, our almost 12,000 members that we have, that's a large group, but do we, closely mirror what the population in Oklahoma is as a whole?
Right.
And, I don't know, because this goes back to our last episode of, first you got to start looking at the numbers. Where are we? Where do we stand? Take your temperature, and we're not even there yet.
Right. It's definitely a prerequisite and a very important step, and we're working towards it.
Absolutely.
So,
well, this is going to continue on. This is going to end our conversation today, but we may have one more episode that we'll bring you to talk about just some other issues related in our conversation with Fred, and again, continue on examining how we're doing as an association and how can we do better. And hopefully at your local association, you can have some of those same conversations, figure out where you are and what direction we may need to be going in.
Right. And it's a continuous work in progress. I don't think the quest for diversity and inclusion will ever end.
Absolutely.
Because it can't.
Right.
Because there's always, like we said, diversity just... I'm making this motion with my hand right now that would explain it, but I'm... They're like roots of a tree. They go in so many different areas and things that, yeah, it's going to be a work in progress.
Absolutely. So we appreciate y'all joining us on this conversation that hopefully sparks some dialogue between you and other realtors, between you and your family, maybe just some internal thoughts and consideration, and maybe thinking about some things in a different way. A lot of things in our conversation with Fred that made me think about things in a different way that I hadn't really considered before. So a lot of stuff to consider so that we can all continue as an association, as individuals, to grow. And we hope to keep bringing you engaging content like that will help you grow as a realtor and as a person right here on Talking Real every single week.
That's right. And if you haven't done so yet, hit that subscribe button so you know when the next episode is out, and share this podcast with a friend and share the love of Talking Real.
Absolutely.
And if you feel so inclined, hit us with the 5-star rating and write us a review. We love hearing from you.
We really do, and we appreciate your support. And until next time, we'll see you next Tuesday on Talking Real.